Okay, let us start. I am Dimitri Bertsimas, one of the two co-organizers of the series, together with Dick and Hertog, Analytics for a Better World. This is the fourth seminar series, seminar in the series. I would like to mention very few words on the philosophy that we have in doing this seminar. We are aiming to introduce to people analytics methods that, as the title suggests, have improved our world in a variety of settings. Just to remind you, we started with COVID, we went to the World Food Program, and then radiation therapy, and we will continue in this framework. The emphasis is not on mathematical theorems and proofs, rather the emphasis is on exciting applications and, most importantly, their impact in the world. We're delighted to invite our fourth speaker in the series, Dr. Frans de Ruiter, who received his PhD recently in the Netherlands, and he's currently working in CQM in Eindhoven. He will talk about improving mobility for elderly and disabled citizens. Just a few logistical remarks. Please introduce your questions in the Q&A. I will then, at appropriate times during the talk, I will express these questions to Frans. Frans will have a particular time in the middle of the talk that he can pause for additional questions, but I will try to manage it at appropriate times so that we don't interrupt too much the flow, but still it's insightful for the audience. Frans, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Dimitri, for the introduction. And I'm very happy and honored to present here in this seminar series. I think you, Dimitri and Dick, you started this, I think 4 or 5 months ago, really at the start of the COVID-19 crisis, and there have been great talks indeed on COVID analytics, the World Food Program, and radiation therapy by Harvard. And I think this is all, I've really been excited by the impact that has shown. And indeed, as you also said in the introduction, I'm going to give a talk to really show the impact of analytics and not necessarily all the theory behind it. What I want to say, so those of you who viewed the talks before, this one is different from those talks in 2 ways. So first of all, the previous talks have either been by universities or large institutions such as the United Nations World Food Program. And this is done by us at CQM. So we are a company with 45 consultants, but we also partner up with a lot of companies, as I'll show later, to ensure that our solution really works in practice. The other thing that it differs on is, of course, the topic. So this is a topic more on the logistics and mobility to help elderly and disabled citizens. And as Dimitri said, if you have any questions, post them in the Q&A, and I'll also try to answer them during the talk as well. Okay, so we are at CQM with 45 consultants. It's a small company, and here I show the faces of all my colleagues that have worked on this project. I especially want to mention in the bottom right, Johan van Rooij, who did most of the work in the beginning of the project, who is now a former colleague from CQM. And then there are a lot of other companies at the bottom that we cooperated with to make this a success. So first of all, it's Transvision. It's the one responsible for the taxi contract that we are optimizing. Then next to our own company, CQM, we have Geodan, which is a partner of us that provides location intelligence service. So we get all bookings of all thousands of trips a day, and we need to put their addresses into coordinates. And that process called geocoding is what Geodan helps us with. And besides that, they also deliver us the high quality map material from TomTom with all the historical speeds on every different road segment. Then we have Ilionics, which is an IT partner that guided the implementation of the IT infrastructure that had to distribute all our rides from Corton, who manages all the bookings, to many different taxi operators who all have different kind of software. Okay, so let me first start by explaining what this taxi contract really is. And then also, I think that most people are maybe not aware how the taxi market looks like in the Netherlands. So the Dutch taxi market, it's about 1.6 billion euros large. And it differs in a lot of ways from taxis that most of you are probably used with. So before I started this project, I only knew taxis of going to the airport in a city on a weekend trip or on a business trip, and I had to take a short taxi ride from the location I arrived to my final last mile destination. So that's what I call the so-called ride hailing. That's what most people assume that's what taxis are. And that's also a field where recently a lot of apps came into, like Uber. You want a taxi, you order one, and you directly get it. In the Netherlands, that's about 25% of the taxi market. So a much larger share of the taxi market is what I would call the contracted taxi world. And that is for specific targets of people. And you can think of health insurers that organize the transport for people that have to go to the hospital, but also, and that's what this talk focuses on people that cannot use their own transport methods, such as elderly or disabled citizens. Now, there are also various contracts that help with that. But the one we're focusing on is the Valys contract, and that is for interregional travel. So that's for relatively long distances within the Netherlands in a social recreational behavior. So this could be to go to a museum, to go to an amusement park, visiting family or friends, but also if you have a job interview or have to attend a funeral somewhere. So we want to have, and that's really unique in the Netherlands, that we have a system subsidized by the government that enables this large group of people that cannot use public transport or their own means of transport to still give them these means of mobility. On right below it, it's Transvision. So Transvision is the one that won the contract from the government and is responsible for the execution of it. And the dots say there are many more of these contracts, but the Valys contract is among them the single largest contract handed out by in all the contract transport in the Netherlands. Okay, so what is the Valys contract really about? So I'll give 4 examples or 4 characteristics that are important also for our analytic solution. So first of all, it's about 450,000 citizens are eligible in the Netherlands. And we have a little bit over 17 million citizens as a whole in the Netherlands, and then 450,000 citizens is a pretty large part. 200,000 of them are active, meaning that they actually take these Valys routes. So not everybody chooses to do it, also because of the reasons that are below. But those who do it, they get also a budget of 700 subsidized kilometers per year. And this is really a large number. So I think most of the Dutch people that are listening, they have families or relatives that have used this Valys contract once to visit them. The other characteristic is that we're talking about relatively long taxi rides. Right? The Netherlands is a small country. So 50 kilometers between the origin and destination of a booking is really a large distance that has to be covered by each booking. So that's on average. So we have much longer rides and some that are slightly smaller. The third characteristic is that because this is subsidized by the government, maybe not for the full price as a ride-hailing app, they allow to pool. So if you are picked up from the place that you want to pick up, your home address, so let's say you're going here from CQM Eindhoven, where I'm now, and I go to Groningen in the north of the Netherlands, then it could be that on the way somebody else is picked up who also has to go near Groningen, and then it's much more efficient for these taxi drivers. And that's of course, so those that already work a lot with analytics, this is a key thing that we can exploit in making very efficient taxi routes. The last part is also an important characteristic, which differs if you want the taxi ride to go now, if you arrive at the airport to go to your hotel, is that all of these bookings, almost all, 90%, is done at least a day in advance. So the bookings for tomorrow, we already now know 90% of the bookings for tomorrow. So that gives us time to optimize and give a good analytic solution. And that's really a benefit over the ones that have to do real-time allocation of taxi rides to taxi drivers. Okay, so how was this done, right? So we have now an analytic solution working and in effect since last January, but this contract already exists in 2004. And even in 2004, it evolved from previous contracts as well. So we have 5,000 of these relatively long 50-kilometer rides on a regular weekend day. It's done 7 days a week, but on a weekend it's slightly more, and then we have 5,000 of these rides on a regular day. Because of the social recreational characteristics, it becomes much more for Christmas. Right? People visiting relatives and friends over Christmas. And we have 15,000 of these rides that have to be done in one day. So how would you solve such a problem? And that's how they did it, up to the point where you have an analytic solution. Well, planning 5,000 of these taxi rides is, of course, an extremely daunting and complex task. So what they did is they divide the Netherlands in 60 different parts. So schematically, you see the squares covering the Netherlands on the right. And they have about 60 different taxi operators. Of course, they are not squares, but they are regions-based areas covering several zip codes. If I make a booking, then I want to go from Eindhoven to the north, to Groningen, that's for instance the red line you see. A booking came in, we see, okay, what is the zip code of Eindhoven? And then we determine, okay, the zip code of Eindhoven is covered by this taxi operator, so this taxi operator gets the ride. Now, if you have 5,000 rides with about 60 taxi operators, some cover a slightly larger area than others, you only have to manage about 50 to 200 rides a day. Of course, it's still not super easy to plan this, but now, of course, it becomes doable to do it manually with Excel or with other kind of things. Now, I think the ones with analytics already see an issue, right? You see the red one going all the way up north to the Netherlands, and back in Netherlands, there up, he doesn't have any other business, right? All other taxi rides are relatively short, so they are around Eindhoven, so he doesn't have business if you end up in Groningen. So that's, of course, where we get the analytic benefit. Well, that's one thing, but I have actually 3 challenges that makes this much more difficult looking forward to the future as well. Right, so we now have 450,000 eligible citizens, but as with actually any other developing country, there's an aging population in the Netherlands. So right now there may be 450,000 citizens eligible, but that number can go quickly if the share of older people, as you see here in the graph, provided by the Central Bureau of Statistics in the Netherlands, grows a lot. So how do we keep this system then even manageable, feasible to get a plan and actually get it working by all the taxis that we have in the Netherlands? The second challenge we have is that there are about 60 different quality standards if you have 60 different taxi operators doing the plan. And it's also not that they don't want to, but it's extremely difficult to determine, am I still within the boundaries of 150% of the driving time? Do I still arrive on time if I pick up someone here? If you have to do this manually, day in, day out, you rely on your experience, but that's definitely, if you get a new taxi ride somewhere where you've never been before, you don't know whether it actually really fits. And then the last part, if you see you have 5,000 taxi rides, and then the distance between origin and destination is 50 kilometers, then just summing up these 5,000 times 50 kilometers, ignoring all the empty kilometers you have to drive to go back, you already get 250,000 kilometers. And then you have to add up all the empty kilometers that you still have to drive to go back. Now, with increasing environmental standards, for instance, the Paris Climate Agreement or the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations, this can become an issue to have this service still available on this large scale. And these are the challenges that we want to address. Okay, so how does our analytic contribution look like? What we've done, we do large-scale central planning, so not the distributed planning over 60 different regions, but as one Netherlands as a whole. We do the planning over all the subcontracted regions. So on the right, you now see an example of a route that first consisted of 3 individual trips allocated to 3 different taxi operators. Now all of a sudden that becomes one route and there are barely any empty kilometers in between. So what are the results of this? It's exactly the 3 challenges are addressed that we did before. First of all, we also get improved customer satisfaction. So we have 50% less registered complaints, and I have to mention that is 50% less on as a percentage of the rides booked. Right? So if there are less rides, we also have less complaints, of course, which is Makes sense during the COVID-19 situation we're in now, but the percentage of all those bookings that give complaints, that has reduced by 50%. So the customers are definitely more happy with the rides that they get. The second one is that we have a future-proof solution for our aging population, in the sense that we need much less kilometers and so much less effort from all the taxi drivers to perform all of these rides. And then I'll give an example later also that illustrates the point below, and that's that we can in this way reduce about 100,000 unnecessary kilometers that you have to drive on average on a day to perform all of these 5,000 or around 5,000 rides. I think this is a good first moment maybe to stop and see whether there are questions on the taxi contract, if there are already any.
Frans, one question by Brian put is, doesn't an operator get a backhaul to his area?
So whether we get a return ride if he has booked something.
What I understood, yes.
Yeah, yeah. So with this analytic contribution, they do, right? So you see here the route that is schematically drawn in the Netherlands. They are going one way and then back to the others. That is all by one operator. However, before, we only assigned the rides being allocated to the departing zip code of a booking. So if I go from Eindhoven to Groningen, then we only look at the zip code of Eindhoven, look which taxi company covers the zip codes of Eindhoven, and they get the ride from Eindhoven to Groningen. Any possible return ride in Groningen has the zip code from Groningen. It's all the way on the other side of the Netherlands. So that's allocated to the taxi driver that has to go, that covers the part in Groningen. So they do not get return rides in the manual system.
There was another question. What does a customer notice from the analytic contribution that they complain so much less?
So, of course, these complaints, they vary a lot, right? So they cover actually all kinds of complaints. But what I think the most important one is that it's extremely difficult to manually control and see whether you're still within the 150% boundary. So it could be that a planner in the past had some rides that were departing all from Eindhoven, go to Groningen, but also maybe a bit to the side of the Netherlands. And they would estimate, okay, if we pick up these 2 passengers in Eindhoven, go all the way to the west of the Netherlands, and then all the way north, their estimate would be, okay, this is 150% of the driving time from the one that, if I go directly from Eindhoven to Groningen. Now what you see is that, of course, very often you then get the complaints, hey, I'm in the taxi much longer than I was expecting to be, namely more than 150% that you guaranteed me.
Yeah, and Frans, I also have a question. In this setting, because this is planning the previous day, are there cancellations the actual day, or is it because of the long-term planning and not so much relevant cancellations?
No, cancellations are definitely something that you have to take into account, because people can cancel the ride on whatever reason they have, of course. If you look here at the blue picture, it could be that one of the rides then disappears from the whole ride. And then either we're going to do it operationally during the day. So we cut loose the entire combination ride and then allocate it individually as would have been done before. So the analytic solution is really only from the previous day. But most often we also compensate the taxi drivers, like, okay, well, you still get paid even though you don't have to pick them up, and then you'll have some more empty kilometers. But the percentage of cancellation is not high. Right? It's I think around 1% or something of the rides gets cancelled. But that's one thing. And you, of course, have many other things. You also have that the taxi breaks down and then you still have to solve it at the moment on the day. Okay.
There's another comment, which I would phrase in a question. Is it the case that the analytical solution reduces the additional time by utilizing multiple riders, or other factors as well?
Does it reduce the time that there are multiple riders?
In other words, combining the riders.
Yeah, so there will be much more combined than was before, because it could be, if I go from Eindhoven to Groningen, that there is someone halfway in the middle of the Netherlands that what is going to be combined. And and in the initial case, that one was not allocated to the same taxi operator near Eindhoven. So there's really a lot of win by doing more of these pooled combinations. And actually, a lot of these elder and disabled people, they like it that they are sharing also the rides with with other people.
What is the capacity of the vehicles generally, Frans?
Now that's also a very interesting question. So we normally say we can put up to 4 in a normal taxi driver if everybody is just as a person. But this is for elderly and disabled citizens, so we have a pretty significant fraction, a little bit over 10%, of people that have other aids such as wheelchairs. And then we also have another type of capacity, other type of vehicle that can also handle these wheelchairs, and then we can put 2 wheelchairs in one taxi.
Okay. And typically, how long does the solution take to find?
I'll get to that also later.
Okay, very good. I think final question, if that's okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you have a guarantee that certain operators will get a certain volume of rides per month where possible?
No, that guarantee is definitely not there. Luckily, because we would have had an issue with these COVID-19 regulations if that would have been the case, because we don't have as many rides as we usually have. Yeah. But it's indeed true. One day they could get more than they would normally have allocated on the old system, and the other day they get less. But it's still that we allocate this combined ride that you see here in blue to the departing zip code of that combination, because that's where the whole combination starts and also returns. So that's where this taxi operator has their drivers. So one that used to cover a larger area of zip codes now also gets more rides than one that only covers a smaller number of zip codes.
And there was another question. How did you convince the taxi companies to go to the system? Did you do a pilot to show the benefits?
Yes, indeed, we had a pilot. So for one to show the benefits, but for the other, you can see if we have 60 different taxi operators. I mean, I think all of them had their different kind of software system. So would they receive the rides in the correct order, and would that all work? So therefore, we definitely had a few months of piloting, sending these taxi operators just a few combinations and keeping the rest as was before. Convincing them is, of course, a very important part and a difficult part, because even if you can quantify that this solution is better, it is still a very difficult, tricky process to convince. And I think the last person I have to convince of that is you, Dimitri. I think there are a lot of parallels also, I think, with the Boston school bus project that you did, where it's been covered in the media. So I encourage everybody to look it up online. Also all the difficulties you had there. And I can relate to almost all, I think. But in the end, we really show that with less time and less kilometers, these taxi drivers can do the same number of rides. That takes a lot of time because sometimes they don't agree with what we find as a good combination as what they would see. I'll also get back to some examples on that later.
Is there time for one more comment question, or would you like to move ahead, Frans?
One more then.
So a comment, in the US, there is an issue about treating the drivers as contractors versus employees. In the Netherlands, they seem to be contractors. Is there an issue that with this distinction?
No, we have a mix of this as well in the Netherlands.
Okay.
Some are self-employed and some are with contractors, but we only contract the larger companies, and I don't know for sure, but they might have other self-employed drivers beneath. That's not an issue for the algorithm.
All right, so you can now continue, Frans.
Good. I'll stop again at some point for more questions, and I hope some things get clarified as well in the next slides. Okay, so what is now the analytic plan of last Saturday, for instance, August 22? So last Saturday, we had 2,320 bookings. And I have to mention, this is about 40% less than normal due to COVID, right? So we serve a lot of elderly and disabled group. So a lot of these people don't take the bookings yet. Now our goal in our analytic solution is to combine, so get the return rides and pull the trips together such that we minimize the total distance or time with a certain fraction. Given the restriction that each passenger should be within this 150% of their direct driving time that they would have done if they go directly from their origin to the destination. Then we first determine all these optimal possible routes, and then we allocate them again to the drivers, as that for each route, the first trip in the route determines which operator it gets based on the zip code. The result for last Saturday was that we had planned that it was about 150,000 kilometers, including where there were passengers in there, empty kilometers in between, and returning to their station. Right, so there's about 25,000 empty kilometers. So this is just one trip from August, and I can show one example of a ride actually that's been there today. So I have to share another screen for that.
It shows, Frans, it says today's example, I can see.
Yeah, but I want to show it in the
in a more
larger. Yeah. So here's an example of a ride that's actually, and I checked it, so it started somewhere in the afternoon. It's still going on until I think about 9 p.m. tonight. The first trip with an _1 is all the way in Groningen. And you see here the routes of all the pickup and drop-off points. So this is a viewer from Geodan that, besides the location intelligence service and the mapping quality, also provides this platform with viewers to various clients. And we partnered up with them here for Transvision. So we start in Groningen, the trip, where the first pickup is. This person has to go to Amsterdam. And on the left bottom, it's maybe a bit small for you, you see the scale of the chart. So the scale there is 50 kilometers. So for people that don't know how large the Netherlands is, this is a pretty long ride from Groningen to Amsterdam. Now, if it goes driving there, it's gonna go stop at Zwolle, another city, and picks up another passenger that also had to go to Amsterdam. So now from Zwolle there with 2 different rides in the car, dropping off in Amsterdam. Normally, the one in Groningen would just drive to Amsterdam and then have to drive back empty because there are no other trips. Now we have a combined trip that stops in Amsterdam, and then within Amsterdam, we pick up somebody else after we dropped off these 2 persons. Instead of driving back, there's apparently most likely no ride from Amsterdam back to Groningen. We first go a little bit further south to Rotterdam, where we drop off the passenger that we just picked up in Amsterdam. There in Rotterdam, there is actually a ride that goes all the way back up north to even to one of the most northerly points in the Netherlands, Lauwersoog. So that person goes from Rotterdam all the way to Lauwersoog, but then in Utrecht, there's somebody else that also has to go up north. So we pick up that person in Utrecht as well, drive all the way up north, and there drop off one person again. Now this is really an example of where we did a lot of combinations. On average, the rides are 50 kilometers, so this contains a few pretty long rides, but especially with these long rides, you can make a huge difference if you count up all these kilometers if they would have been returned individually as well. So coming up with a plan that you go to Amsterdam and you don't find a return trip, but even go a little bit further south to Rotterdam before you find your return trip, it's a very complex task if you do not use an analytic solution, of course. Furthermore, if you have this solution, it is also very tricky to check, am I within the 150% boundaries? To do that, you need to know all the travel distances and all the travel times between all of these points that are drawn here. And I'll also come to it later. You not only need the travel times and travel distances between all the points that are drawn in one route, but since the algorithm wants to choose and see where it wants to go, we actually need all distances and all travel times between all possible points. So that is a big challenge as well. Okay, so this was one example. How does this algorithm now work? So this is coming back to the question of Dimitri. We have all these rides booked a day in advance. Now all the operators, the taxi operators, they sleep at night. So the night is the perfect time where we do our analytic algorithm, and it only has to be ready at the time where the first operator would wake up. So our algorithm has about 4 hours time to do a lot of computations to find the optimal route. And here I depicted the pipeline of how this would work. So we have these 5,000 or 2,000 in case of last Saturday with COVID-19 size of trips. And then the first step is to put all of these addresses into coordinates so that we know where on the map they are. So this process is called geocoding, which is what our partner Geodan is doing. Seems very easy, right? We have an address, we look where it's up on the map, and that's going to be the point. But there's actually more intelligence involved in that because you want the point on the map to be, for instance, at the front door and not at the back door or somewhere else. So then we get this set of trips and we know the points on the map where they are geocoded. Then comes a difficult part also where we have to calculate the distances and travel times, not only between origin and destination, but we don't know yet how we're going to optimize. So we want distance and travel time between all possible points. Well, if you have 5,000 routes, then between all possible points, this is 5,000 times 5,000 distances and travel times that you have to do. I'll get back to how we do that later a little bit as well, but that is a huge number, even if every route would only take a millisecond. So then we get the trips, and we get all distances and travel times between all these trips, and they're going to be input in our optimization algorithm, which is in our case a simulated annealing algorithm. So that is a heuristic algorithm that combines all trips together in a very fast implementation, so we can do hundreds of millions of iterations to find the optimal route. The benefit of having a simulated annealing algorithm is that it is very agile. If during the process where we first started until where we implemented or even after, if we get new restrictions, then we can simply implement them in the requirements that is in the simulated annealing algorithm. Now, then there are about 3 to 4 hours spent in this pipeline, and we get the pool trips, and then it comes the task of distributing them, which is done by Corton to all different 60 different taxi operators. And that's about 4 or 5 a.m. They have all the rides in their system, and when they wake up, they can assign the drivers themselves, the taxi operators. Okay, I think it's another good natural moment to stop and see if there are any questions.
One question is, are the times also dependent on how the ride is executed to model traffic jams?
Yeah, that's a very good point, indeed. So the extra complication is not just getting the travel times as it would be on average over the day, but if you start at 8 a.m. in the morning, the Netherlands is a small country, and everybody who's actually ever been here with a car knows that there are a lot of traffic jams outside the COVID-19 era, of course. So leaving at 8 a.m., taking the highway to some route, gives you another travel time than if you would have left it exactly the same route at, for instance, 1 p.m. In the afternoon. So yes, we also take into account that all these travels are time dependent. But not so. You mentioned traffic jams as an example. So this is not. These are not traffic jams, but the normal rush hour patterns, because we cannot predict traffic jams a day in advance.
There are more questions. Do you model driver breaks or shifts short enough so that we don't worry about it?
Yeah. So we have regulations in the Netherlands that say, oh, after so many hours, a driver has to rest. And that is, of course, taken into account whether a route is called feasible or not, or allowed. And besides that, so rest is one thing, but also from the passenger side, you have to see, we're working on elderly and disabled people. If they have a wheelchair, yes or no, they might take more time to get into the taxi. So you have more time at each stop.
And what is your experience with geocoding quality? And what do you do after the planning at night if you discover that only a small fraction is wrongly decoded?
So to be really honest, I haven't seen any single instance of where we drop off someone in the middle of the field, of course, but I would have heard of that for sure. But the quality of geocoding is, for I know, very good and even better than other services like Google. We had points that Google couldn't determine where they were in the Netherlands or couldn't find a route, and then the geodon services definitely could. So
another question is that there is still a small optimization chance to fit the 10% of rides that are booked the same day as the departure day in the planned rides. Are you looking at that chance?
No, so at the moment, we really try to find the optimum for this 90%. And if we have these routes, they are so jam-packed that normally it wouldn't really fit to have another route in between because you violate the 150%. However, 10% is still quite a significant amount. So we still have to look into these more real-time parts. But of course, you can also look at all kind of different contracts. So for instance, for hospital transports, we also have different requirements and maybe are booked more on the day itself. So at the moment, it is all a pre-allocation done at night, but we're also looking at possibilities to include the rides that are booked during the day.
Another question is that are there any conditions on pickup or arrival time for each trip? For example, someone trying to get to an airport on time. In other words, is there a threshold that you have to complete a trip by?
Yeah, definitely. The vast majority actually determines a pickup time and then is delivered anywhere between 100 and 150% of the travel time. But I mentioned in the beginning that we have various reasons why people go somewhere. They can also go somewhere for a job interview or to attend a funeral. All those things we find really more important, and they say, really, hey, we have to be here at 1 p.m. And then they also get a guarantee that they arrive there well before 1 p.m. So the vast majority only has a window for departure with 100 and 150% travel time, but there's also a small part of important rights to funerals, job interviews that have definitely a small important window at arrival.
Related, are there time windows for the trips, and how much flexibility is there in the departure times?
Yeah, so we have about a few minutes that we can pick up somebody earlier or later. And then, of course, we can arrive somewhere too early, wait a bit before they are in the window.
Other questions, Frans. You indicated that calculating 5,000 by 5,000 is expensive computationally, which is the case for the Netherlands. Is the current approach scalable for larger countries with significantly more rights?
Yes, and I'll get to that also later.
If you have 15,000 trips at Christmas, let's say, is it still feasible to compute a 15,000 by 15,000 distances and travel times matrix? This is a related.
I'll get to that, yeah.
Very good. Okay. I think we have exhausted. Actually, there's more. How do you account for inclement weather?
Oh, that is also a really good one. So in principle, we have a configuration that can see, sometimes we could adjust parts saying like, okay, we expect slower travel times tomorrow than would normally be. But in general, that is still a very, very difficult thing. And we have a code system in the Netherlands, like yellow, orange, red. And if it is red, which is really when you get a kind of disruption in traffic, then all rides are canceled anyway. So people cannot use the travel system in this code red system. So these are not like US hurricanes, but still they code red that they really impede traffic.
And another question, how is the distribution of the pooled trips done?
That one I don't really understand.
In other words, there are trips have been decided. I would say, how do you assign drivers? I think what
Yeah, so we do not assign the drivers. We assign routes to different taxi operators that in the morning decide who's going to do it. And the allocation of the routes is all based on the departure of the first trip, because that has to lie in the zip code area of this operator.
Or maybe how do you assign there? I assume there are more than one companies that are involved, right?
Yes, but we have a disjunction in the areas, so there's no overlap in the areas that are assigned to one taxi operator.
By algorithmic approaches. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, Frans, go ahead with the next part.
But thanks for all the questions. That's great. Okay, so now we want to compare actually the 150,000 kilometers that we got last Saturday with our analytics algorithm. How much would that be if we do not have an analytics algorithm? Well, this is always, in any practical approach, a very difficult thing to do. We have 60 different taxi operators, and they all plan manually. We cannot send them the Saturday plan and say, oh, can you do it as if you would have done it manually? First of all, they really don't feel like doing that. And one day could be very different from planning as they would do another day. So we have to mimic how one of these plans would have looked like, perhaps, if there wouldn't be an analytics approach. So how did we do that? We look at these 2,320 bookings, the exact same bookings as our analytics plan got. Then our first step is, what if we would allocate these rides to the taxi drivers based on the departing zip code of each trip? In that way, you get 60 sets of rides, and every set has the departure within the zip code area and then spread out all over the Netherlands. And in that way, we could say, okay, in the past, all they could do was drive and have to drive back empty all the way. But that's of course not true. But it could be that there are two people, two rides in Eindhoven near the same time that both have to go to Groningen or a surrounding city. And then they could already have combined it. So we're going to solve these 60 different sets of rides individually with our optimization algorithm. And then there are a few side notes, because one, of course, this is a heuristic algorithm, so we can't prove it is optimal, but for these small sets, I'm very, very certain that it's close to optimal. But on the other hand, it could be that taxi operators have rides from other contracts that they could also have combined it with. That cannot be done in a very, very significant large volume way, because the Valys contract is the only one that does these long trips of 50 kilometers on average. The other ones are much, much smaller. So on the one hand, we have an analytic algorithm that most likely plans a bit better than a manual planner could do. And on the other hand, they might have combined it with other rides from other contracts. If we solve these 60 plans with our analytics algorithm, then add up all of the kilometers in that plan, we get 220,000 kilometers, of which about 100,000 kilometers is empty without a passenger in there. So comparing the mimicked manual plan of a taxi operator, where we solve 60 small plans, gets 220,000 kilometers, versus the analytic plan, the one that was actually used last Saturday, has 150,000 kilometer plan. So that's a reduction of about 70,000 kilometers, with, in this case, 25,000 kilometers empty. Of course, the empty kilometers is not the main focus, because you just want to minimize the total kilometers, also including the pooling, yes or no. And what also has to be noticed is that August normally is a very busy month. And so we have 40% less bookings than normal. So 2,320 bookings is a small number. In a normal year like last year, this would have been much higher, over 3,000 for sure. And then because we have a larger pie, the 70% is taken over a larger pie and we reduce more kilometers on the one hand. But on the other hand, if you have just more routes, trips plotted over the Netherlands, we have a much denser map of trips, so we can also combine much better, because the probability that there is somebody that you can pick up in between or as a return ride is much larger if you have more trips. So it really goes with scale that there is much more reduction in the planning of kilometers. Okay, so then I want to go more to the questions that I also had before about how do you do this with these large distance calculations, how do you convince taxi operators, etc. And therefore I want to show that how you go from a textbook problem, so the ones that have worked in analytics, they have seen these kinds of problems. They're called vehicle routing problems, in this case with time windows is a variant of that. And optimizing this, most of you have seen in a textbook. And then it would say, find the optimal allocation of rides that minimize the total distance or total time. You have about 10 to 500 locations, probably more around 10, and there's just one objective that I just stated. So there are many things that you have to take into account if you want to have an analytic solution in practice. And I just want to highlight two. One is exactly the part like, oh, you have 10 to 500 locations, and we have a big book containing all the distances and times, with one competing objective. If we go to practice, which is what we faced with CQ1 and Geodon, we have for each ride an origin and destination. So 5,000 to 15,000 rides on a Christmas get you 10,000 to 30,000 locations. For our algorithm, we need the distance not just between origin and destination and a few other points, but we want the distances between all possible points that are on the map. So it's 10,000 times 10,000, or even 30,000 times 30,000 locations. It's a huge number, and you'll get a huge so-called distance matrix, a square containing all the distances and travel times. And then I don't even mention that we still want those also to be time dependent, that in a rush hour time we have a different time than during the day. The second part is that the objective is just stated as find an allocation that everybody's happy with. This is, from an analytic side, not really satisfactory yet, because we can't quantify everybody being happy, let alone weighing how happy are you versus how happy are you. And I give an example of competing objectives is, for instance, that for passengers, it would be great if we have a lot of time to get into the car and a lot of buffer times in the travel to make sure that you always arrive on time. But if you look at a taxi driver, all these possible buffer times and waiting times in between, they decrease your efficiency of your run because it will take you longer to complete the entire route. So this is just two of the competing objectives, and there can be many. So what you have to do in that case is really align with all the different stakeholders. So there's the main contractor, those are the taxi people, those are the passengers, the operators, and the taxi drivers themselves. What you also have to take into account is that we as analytics that make these solutions, we see the full picture, right? We see these 5,000 rides, we also quantify everything. If we send these solutions to all the people that have to execute it, we first chop it in 60 pieces because they only get part of the routes. So they already only see 1/60th of it. And then if you zoom in further and the taxi driver gets it, he only gets one route. So if that route is, according to him, not great, he can say, okay, this is not a good way to combine routes. And therefore, you really have to keep them aligned, which is a very long process as well. Now, let me go to the point where most people from analytics were waiting for, namely the matrix allocation, or so the distance and times between all different points. There are, and this is also definitely something I learned from Dimitri during my time at MIT, but also from Dick and others. There is a big difference between an algorithm being fast in theory and fast in practice. Normally, it's actually the way around that we say, in theory, this is a really bad algorithm, but in practice, it goes super fast. Here it is the other way around. In theory, we have these so-called polynomial time algorithms that can determine all these distances between all different locations. But if you scale this up to this point of 30,000 times 30,000, then everything that was fast in theory takes way too long, or more than a night to calculate. So you have to adapt these algorithms to, and I think the most win we had was by cleverly pre-processing the map and calculating some landmark dark distances before, as well as a very smart parallel execution. And this is something that started here at CQM, I think, decades ago. So even before competing services like Google existed, we already needed these matrices. So over the last decades, this evolved in this super fast algorithm that we could do on a huge scale. And I want to give an example of that. So 30,000 locations is not yet the limit of our algorithm. So this is just a small side story. What you see here on a map with all the dots are all the national monuments in the Netherlands. We have about 63,000 of them. So what do? We want to say, hey, can we do something nice or fun with that? So we contacted a professor in Canada called Bill Cook, who is an expert also on the traveling salesman problem. And he has the same problem if he looks at these traveling salesman problems for a country. He doesn't have a big book with all the distances and travel times between all locations. And it is very difficult to, within your algorithm, find all these routes all the time when you need them. It's much easier to build an agile algorithm if you have it all in one go. So we contacted it, and he actually, so together we came up with a nice idea to make the shortest possible bike tour visiting all 63,000 national monuments in the Netherlands. I think this alone would also yield analytics for a better world if we would all step on our bikes and do this bike tour, 63,000 national monuments. But of course, it's not really suitable for our target group here of elderly and disabled citizens to do this route. Anyway, the 63,000 times 63,000 gets you 4 billion routes. But our algorithm on parallel, so it's not run on a supercomputer, but on a server with about 30 processors, takes just 2 hours to calculate. And now at night we have about 4 or 5 hours, so that gives us another 2-3 hours to optimize for our heuristics, even if we have this giant number of rides. So this is still ongoing work, so you can check the CQM website later to see what we found out. I've zoomed in a bit on some monuments that are close to my own home address. So you see it's dotted all over the Netherlands with a large part in Amsterdam. But if you ever visit the Netherlands again, really wander out to all these other places as well. And if you do that, we still have the COVID-19 regulations. So when you go back by plane, we'll have the route for you to visit all of them. Okay, so that's how we do the matrix calculations. By the way, this is actually also taking into account from Geodan a map with all cycling lanes, which is a different map than the one for driving cars. So this matrix algorithm that we have does not only work for cars, but also for bikes, and actually we use it in a lot of our projects, whether there are containers, packages that need to be delivered for multimodal transport as well. Okay, so then the other part, which you have issues in practice, what do you do with a trip that nobody wants? Right, so they don't have a say in whether they get the trip or not, but we have to allocate it and think about it. So let me try to explain what you see in the picture here. We have three routes. So we have the blue route that you've already seen before in one of the slides. We have the red route as another combination. And then we have this purple route that's not been placed in any route yet. And it doesn't fit nicely, because if the red one would have to do it, you have to drive a lot of empty kilometers. If the blue one has to do it, they also have to drive a lot of empty kilometers. Now, we could say operator A gets it, because if we wouldn't have the analytic algorithm, operator A would have to do it anyway, and it would be 50 empty kilometers for him. Operator B can also do it, and with only 40 empty kilometers. But it's really in his mindset saying, okay, I'm now solving somebody else's problem. Right? I have to drive 40 empty kilometers for something that is for decades has not been my problem. And here you really need the alignment with all the stakeholders to explain them that, hey, today, operator B, you have to do this right, that doesn't fit nicely. But there's another day, or even today, where there's a route that doesn't fit nicely in one of your routes that somebody else is fixing. If you would have this as a one-shot solution, then this would really be a problem, because they don't want to solve somebody else's problem. But since we do this every day, thousands of routes per day, you really hope that they get along with this. But this principle of fairness in who gets to solve difficult rights is a difficult thing, and it's really something that you have to take into account if you try to convince taxi operators, or also and especially drivers, to come along. Okay, so finally, I have another point which is really important that we try to do from the start, is making an agile algorithm. And this is something that is not educated, at least from my time back in university, is that agility in algorithms is important. You don't get the defined problem when you start. If you go to a client, a project, or they say, okay, this is our problem, and on the go, extra requirements will come. Or some things will happen that you have to change your algorithm. And therefore, some algorithms that might look superb in the beginning, but really cannot handle any other requirements or constraints, are really not as good as the ones that are agile, that are easy to change. So examples of agile algorithms would be mixed integer programming, where you can add constraints, but also these simulated annealing algorithms that we used here that can usually handle a lot of non-linearities. So here we have two examples. We went live in the 1st of January. At the mid-November 2019, you see the news article on the left. The Netherlands said, okay, we need to, we're going to slash the speed limit to reduce all nitrogen emissions in the Netherlands. You have to imagine you're about 6 weeks from going live, and what we use are all the TomTom speed maps, profiles of historic data that we know on each small road segment what the speed is. And now all of a sudden, there will be some point somewhere where you say, okay, this is going to be a completely different speed on a lot of roads in the Netherlands. So what is we know what the maximum speed will be, but that's not the average or actual driving speed that a taxi would do. So Geodan also came up with a very clever way of saying, okay, this is going to be our estimate of the new speed given what we had before. And then after a few months' time, when we get more data, we can change these speeds again if TomTom updates them. Okay, then the other part on the right, it's a famous picture for everybody in the Netherlands, because this is one of the regular press conferences by our Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, Minister De Jonge, and in the middle, the almost equally famous by now translator for the hearing impaired. And there they come up with all the COVID-19 regulations. And these, so the one on the left was still announced It took effect months, but the corona crisis, you know, there's going to be a new measure and it's going to be in effect tomorrow or in a week's time. So you really have to be agile and quickly respond to that. So this taxi algorithm, of course, we transport elderly and disabled citizens. So it's only just started up again after our small lockdown. We haven't been in lockdown like other countries around the world, but we had a small lockdown also, no transport in the Valys contract. So that's starting up now, but we still don't have the numbers that we would have expected in 2019. I think that is where I also end my presentation. I want to conclude with that smart, modern analytic solutions enable huge scale planning. So we had two advantages. One is you don't look at the decentralized planning, but now all of a sudden you can look at a whole central plan. Without analytics, you can say, the greatest benefit is looking from a decentralized plan to a central plan. Could be the case, but a central plan cannot be handled manually. You need an analytic solution for that. So it is both from going decentral to central and having an analytic solution. We had 50% less as a percentage of the rides registered complaints. So we halved the percentage of complaints per ride. We have a massive reduction in driving kilometers. So I've shown this Saturday 70,000, but on a regular day that is well, so I guess that's up to 100,000, but well over 100,000 kilometers. And then the last part is more as an advice for having analytics, making impact in practice. Agility in your algorithm is important, and also align with various stakeholders, which is not in the textbook.
Thank you.
So that's where I want to end, and then we have, I hope, a few more minutes for some.
A few minutes for questions. Thank you very much. Great talk, Frans. So one question is that it says that you reduce a lot of kilometers, but how about waiting time for the taxi drivers? Are taxi drivers still happy? And so forth. So what are other objectives? Or how about earning by less kilometers? Do they earn less, the drivers?
Well, you have to see the most important factor for a taxi driver is the amount of time it takes him to complete the rides. So they get paid for all the distance between origin and destination. So if you pull them, they can also get paid more. Of course, there's more financials behind it that I don't want to go into detail about it. And definitely not all taxi operators were happy in the beginning. And maybe some of them are not happy now yet because they are used to doing the planning in another way. But we're also in a situation in the Netherlands that we don't have unlimited number of taxis. Definitely not for the future, but also in the current situation now. So I think taxi operators are pretty happy with the shortage with drivers that they can do these rides more efficiently. So I really argue that this is a win for everybody, for the passengers, for the environment, for a contractor, the taxi operators, and the drivers. But yes, not everybody has the same analytic viewpoint as we would have as analytic practitioners.
There was another question about the fairness principle, like the principle of fairness for unwanted trips. Is it part of the algorithm that you distributed evenly over a year?
So it is kind of naturally happening because a taxi operator that already had a large zip code area keeps the same large zip code area and therefore gets more routes because more routes have a departing trip there. It could be that there is a slight variation, but we run this in principle for 365 days. So that kind of evens out and it's not strictly in there. For routes that really do not fit nicely, we always have the option of, hey, we send it individually and then the taxi operator can do whatever he wants. They get a premium for that so that they have to plan them themselves. So if it doesn't fit nicely anywhere, they get the routes individually. So that's more how the fairness goes. But the largest part of fairness is talking with the taxi operators that how this algorithm also helps for them.
Great. So it's 12 o'clock. Thank you, Frans. I remind everybody that our next Analytics for a Better World seminar would be September 22nd, which is a Tuesday as opposed to a Monday, as opposed to a Wednesday that we have done it so far. And the speaker is Recep Levy, talking about some of his work in the partners healthcare system in Boston. I think it will be an exciting talk, and we will send you details. Thank you for your attendance, and thank you, Frans, for an excellent presentation.
Yeah, if there are any more questions, feel free to contact me, and I'm happy to talk further, of course. And again, thank you very much for the invitation. I was really happy that we could show this to you.
Great.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
See, I'm not sure how it goes because I can also answer some more questions now, or the channel needs to be used. What is the policy?
I think we have the bandwidth for some time, but it might be best if people write to you, Frans.
Okay, let's do that then. Okay.
Thank you again, Frans. Great presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Dimitri and Dick.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Many thanks, Frans. It was fantastic.